Hello there, Callum here, and welcome to the EU in Review, where I review the Star Wars Expanded Universe as I experience it. And this time, I'm going to be talking about the Droids comics. I did the Ewoks comics last time, the first 9 issues, but this has a reason to the madness of swapping over to the Droids comics, because there is a very interesting crossover event that they did starting issue 4 of the Droids comics. These are written by David Manek and illustrated by John Romita. So, basically overall, these are fun little comics. I find them a little bit better than the Ewoks comics as far as feeling like cartoony and kiddie. They're a bit easier to read, at least in my mind, but they are still very much made for kids, as you can tell, and obviously connected to the Droids cartoon, so they have a similar sort of feel to it, which it was good while it was there. Definitely for kids though. And the continuity is like, what? Especially in the crossover event, but I'll get to that in another video. But for now, I think this is quite interesting how Marvel had an imprint for child readers as well, which is Star Comics, which they printed the Ewoks and Droids comics over, and these are interesting to see some of the early ideas that they had, and what is pretty much the only thing that we had at this time. Anyway, onto the spoilers, because I took my notes as I read the comics. Issue 1 is titled The Destroyer. And R2 and 3PO are an interesting duo to read, I was thinking, because R2 makes his noises of all sorts and 3PO is really the only one with real dialogue out of them, and yet it still works. That's something that's really cool in these. And apparently they're finding a new owner, Lot Kemp. So I'm wondering, like, I'm assuming this takes place between Revenge of the Sith and A New Hope. But even then it must have to take place somewhere else, because they were with Bail Organa. And what I was thinking is something like before the adventures in hyperspace and after the Lando Calrissian adventures. But it's still weird because it's like they were still owned and looked after by Bail Organa and they were serving on the Tantive in A New Hope. But I guess that's where the continuity of this comes into play, and I'm thinking like this really doesn't fit into the main continuity. Unless it just so happens that this is before the Phantom Menace. And R2 and 3PO both had different jobs beforehand. Which doesn't make sense, because Anakin built 3PO as he is. But anyway, it's just weird continuity things there. It sets up a situation where Cug will send a killer droid after anyone who doesn't pay his taxes. It's a basic bad guy mafia enforcement type, which is funny. Cug looks like a Gamorrean crossed with an Ugnaught, which I thought was funny. And there is a funny little gag with R2 carrying all of the gear and 3PO isn't. They introduce a Ranger X1 defense robot. Yes, they called it a robot and not a droid, which is interesting. And apparently some droids were outlawed when the Intergalactic Law Agency was founded, which according to this comic was years ago. Now, surely I would think it's been longer for continuity, although if we're going hypothetically and trying to make these fit as best they can, what if we have a 3PO and R2 that met up in the gap between Star Wars The Old Republic and the Phantom Menace and had adventures then? And then what ended up happening was that R2 was destroyed and refurbished, same name, and 3PO was destroyed in the basic brain module for his personality and everything was picked up by Anakin from the scrapyard, and then what other bits and pieces were rebuilding him. That could work, and especially given the crossover event, which is interesting. It's interesting how the Ranger unfolds from the box into a very classic humanoid robot design, very much reminding me of Transformers and other robots. It's a funny gag with 3PO being knocked over. And then we have part 2 of this, the showdown. Which is interesting how the Ranger was about to be destroyed, but R2-D2 zooms in, steals power from the destroyer and diverts it into the Ranger. So it's basically an R2-D2 ex machina, which is hilarious. I find it funny. Now it's just like, alright, this little droid is able to get into the destroyer, take his power. Why couldn't he defeat the destroyer anyway? But you're not supposed to ask those questions. But apparently afterwards, R2 has micro synapse damage, which I'm not even sure how synapses would work with droids, because of course we have synapses in our brain and in our nervous system, but I don't think that droids or robots would have a nervous system. Anyway, I'm trying to think too much into it, I guess. And it ends nicely with 3PO saying that he's proud of R2. Oh. Issue 2 is titled The Ultimate Weapon. The dialogue on the cover doesn't quite make sense. Or at least it's just bad. Because it has it doesn't really fit any part of the story in it. They would have been better off leaving the front cover without any dialogue in it. Anyway. It opens with R2 damaged. So it's interesting how whatever short-term fix they did in the last issue, it didn't last. And 2 characters in the background that they had, when only the boy Joss had joined them before. So yes, in the first issue, they encountered a boy named Joss, which they became his temporary servants. And he's gone along with them to find their master. It's interesting. The 2 are different characters, so there's a bit of a disconnect between issue 1 and issue 2, and whatever happened to Jost. Who knows? So they have a cartridge of energy, they slot into R2 somehow. And 3PO seems to accept new masters rather quickly, especially since there was no transaction of ownership that we know of. And yet there's 2 random people that they're just like, okay, we're your masters now. And he's just like, okay, good sirs. I'm like, what? Why are you accepting new masters so quickly? And apparently, in this time, there's a lack of masters. What? Anyway, the girl has the last fragrance, Nova Starlight, which I find funny being in a comic about the 2 droids. Then we have part 2 of this called In the Company of Evil. And Nikki and Vic are weird names, but they're the 2 kids, because it's made for kids, they made the Masters kids, the claimed ownership of the droids. Now it looks like they forgot to colour a circle on Vicky in one panel. The father of the 2 kids is named Lon Edo. The last name reminds me of Battle Angel Alita, of course, even though this came a lot earlier. Although, Yukito Kishiro was inspired by Star Wars, so maybe he read the Droids comics and saw the last name of Edo and liked it. You never know. There's a nice plot of people trying to force him to install a weapon on their ship when he's a pacifist. The classic threaten to the child story trope though. Of course, back then it wasn't so done. It does upend it a bit with Nikki trying to fight compared to just being helpless. So Nikki's the female kid, the girl, and she tries to fight them so she's not a complete damsel in distress. Yeah, and I thought it was funny that Nikki calls one of the guys Fatso as well. Somehow 3PO must have a database of known mobsters, as he knows this Tig from. I don't know why he would have a database on mobsters, but anyway. Somehow, just by installing a laser weapon, this Tig from thinks his father will be proud of him as a mobster. What? It's just funny. It's interesting how they introduce a Guardian droid that they'll inevitably use later, because you can go, well, they're going to use it, aren't they? Part 3 is shock treatment. And they use R2's damage to have him basically be a small electrical storm. Making use of the damage to help, I think, was actually a clever idea, which is pretty good. Blowing a fuse has a massive amount of energy. I would not think that so much energy was inside an astromech droid, but who knows. Also, the facial expression on the aliens is funny. R2 getting blasted is a bit sad, but makes sense, and of course we know he'll be alright, because he'll be back. But also, why was 3PO so worried in A New Hope if he knows that R2 has been blasted before? Now, of course, I think by my theory at the moment, these were set in between the gap in the Old Republic and the Russo Reformations, or even after the Russo Reformations, but certainly a little bit before Anakin's generation. They would have to be destroyed and reworked. Anyway, fun times. It's interesting how 3PO will up and leave R2 to find a way to help his temporary masters. And apparently masters are hard to come by. I'm thinking that masters being hard to come by and his belief of that is actually a quirk of his programming at this time into believing that. Anyway, 3PO goes inside of the Guardian droid. And what I did wonder about this was, did he gut it, or was it already a shell? Also, Vicky uses a perfume to distract Tig, the perfume that was shown earlier, Nova Starlight. Good for distractions of mobsters. And wow, 3PO goes ham on the mover droids. I didn't know his programming allowed for combat at all. 3PO in these comics has some very odd programming, which I'm like, if he can do all that, wow. It's cool how the Guardian droid shell does protect him from laser fire, and Tig is caught in a net because he can't kill people in a kid's comic. And also, R2 is a different colour from the movies in this comic, and sometimes part of him aren't coloured when most of the time they are. I'm like, little art bits and pieces that I notice. Issue 3 is titled The Scarlet Pirate. And this starts off with an exposition that R2 and 3PO have been bought by a wealthy government official on the planet Major. Ambassador Zell and his son, Les, was introduced. And amongst all the weird names, Les seems like, g'day Les, how you going? Seems such a normal name. Anyway, the ambassador is going on a mission to another planet, Armith, while he wants the droids to babysit his son, which is funny. Droids looking after his son. And obviously leaving us with a kid to make it relatable to other kids. And Les has a mohawk and thinks about dismantling them and selling them for parts, so it's really just a horror of a kid and a brat. But apparently that's from his father not being around much, so there's your moral of the story. And they have the Scarlet Pirate Red Jack, which is a funny name. But honestly, Les shouldn't have been able to save Red Jack, because Les randomly takes out a whole guard of people that are imprisoned Red Jack. And somehow his father is useless at knowing the technology that he's giving Les was actually useful. It's like, what? But also, Red Jack really looks like the mustache twirling villain, which is cool. And then the third part, end of the game. There's a chicken man. That's canon to the Star Wars universe, well, the EU, is Chicken Man exists, at least in this comic. And Les realises what Red Jack is actually like, which I think is a good way to shock him into realising he was wrong. Bit of the moral of the story of not idolising criminals. And there's a double-headed alien, and this was released before The Phantom Menace as well. Zell ended up being pretty badass, but they lost the master by Zell deciding he can go on missions without him, which is interesting. Zell is Les's dad, I think I mentioned that, but yeah. Doesn't quite add up. You think Les still needed protecting and help, but maybe it's the whole thing of like, oh, my child was in danger, I need to make sure I'm with him more and looking after him, sort of thing. That's good. But anyway, overall, pretty fun comics, to be honest, although still quite childish, but not as hard to read through as the Ewoks comics I found, so it's good. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one. Uru!